G'day and kia ora. Aotea here. Welcome to part 6 of my War Thunder skinning tutorial series. This episode is panel marking. Last time I added the roundels and serials to the camo, both using pre-existing and custom built ones. Today I'll be looking at adding all of the extra details to a skin, something that really helps to add to the authenticity of a project. We'll be looking at historical accuracy, fonts that work, shapes and symbols, and problem panels. While pilots got to know their aircraft really well, ground crews at frontline bases might be working on 5 or 6 different types on any one day. Each plane had a different configuration, with oil and fuel filler caps in different locations and different places on a wing where you could and couldn't stand. So most military aircraft had a number of placarded panels, usually with some important technical information abbreviated and stenciled. But, and this is a big but, there was a huge variation in what was stenciled onto an aircraft. Not just between different planes, but also between different models of the same plane, and sometimes even between the same make and model in the same squadron. Planes got damaged and then repaired, and then repainted. Parts were cannibalised from one airframe and used on another. There is very little detailed photography of these minor markings, so anything you decide to include is, at best, an educated guess. For example, most aircraft had pretty standard warnings on the control surfaces. No step on the ones near the cockpit, and no push on the others. None of my photos show any evidence of these, so should I include them or not? I do have some shots of the only Vengeance left in the world. It's an RAAF one and it's in the city where I live, but unfortunately the museum where it's housed closed a couple of years ago. Permanently. But I do have this photo. You can just make out the words handhold in small black letters. So that's a pretty good indication that there were stenciled warnings on the plane, even if the photos don't really show them. I'm going to put on the standard ones. You want a good sans serif block font. One with stencil marks is great, but at smaller sizes you may lose those little breaks in the letters anyway. For bigger marking I use Stenciller. It's a font I downloaded from dafont.com. In terms of colour, I'll start with my knockdown black, but that may end up too dark, so I may be forced to reduce the opacity of the layer later on. Let's try it on no step. Okay, let's put in the others. And the no push on the ailerons, flaps and rudder. There are also handholds under each of the hand grips, and the word slide with an arrow under the front canopy. Arrows are just another type of panel marking using symbols and shapes. Now I could draw it in using the polygonal lasso tool, but the easiest way to create this one is just to use one of the arrows that comes with the custom shape tool. So I'll click here and up here and then select it from here. Let's draw it. And that's pretty close. There are also fuel filler caps on each wing. I can't find any detailed evidence of what the ones on our Vengeance look like, so I'm going to make a standard US filler cap from the early 40s. A flat red disc with 4 protruding tabs to allow you to grip it and turn it. I'll make the disc on one layer and those tabs on a separate layer using drop shadows and bevel and emboss to get the desired effect. I'll also use the standard US fuel label. Again, it's not visible in the photos, but they were almost always added near the fuel tanks. There's also the Propeller blade manufacturer sticker and prop spec stencil. I'm using the Hamilton standard logo. It's a lot sharper than the one that came with the default camo, and I'll be using that default camo as a guide for placement. The prop spec stencil is going to be so small that no detail will really be visible, but I still like to keep the format about right. I'll use the info from a photo of a Mustang prop that I took at Oshkosh back in 2015. And reduce the size. That's about right. Now here's one that wasn't a standard warning sign. I found a shot of a warning near the cheese grater on the wing. Unfortunately, there's no record of which service this plane belonged to, and it was a close-up photo, so it may not have even been an RAAF one. But I like it, and it would make sense, so I'm going to add it. It reads, "Danger, keep hands well clear when dive brakes extended." I wonder how many amputated ground crew fingers it took before these became a standard placard. I've also seen some discussion about the colour of the inside of the dive brakes. Some say they were standard zinc chromate green, but others swear that they remember them being painted red like the inside of a dive brake from a Dauntless or a Helldiver. So I'm going to go for red. Okay, that pretty much wraps it up for this session. But before we go, I wanted to briefly mention that this is a brilliant model. Not my skin, but the model itself. Well done, Gaijin developers. They are not all as skinner friendly as the Vengeance. Occasionally you might run into a plane where the C-map seems perfectly reasonable. Take the F-86 for example. Here it is, looks fine. But what you can't see immediately is that the starboard air brake isn't actually used. It's there on the image, and it could have been used. It's not like that area is being used for anything else. But no, the starboard air brake is a mirrored version of the port one. So they just take a copy of the one on the left side and flip it and use it on the right. The same sort of thing happens on the top surface of the Hunter. Both wings are visible and you can put any camo you want on them, but there is one little panel which is mirrored. So those two areas of your camo have to be the same colour, otherwise they stand out. Some planes have an extra space set aside for the skin to wrap around the front side of the rudder, the Mustang for example, which means that anything painted across the whole tail needs to allow for this big gap. Oh, and for some reason the rudder is a slightly different scale from the tail fin, so you'll need to change the size of your text and the position slightly if you want it to match. And let's not forget the Kingfisher floatplane, where everything works pretty well, except that for some reason every cowl flap is flipped top to bottom and front to rear. Obviously some modeller at Gaijin wanting to troll us poor skinners. Well played, sir. Well played. Now this all inevitably leads to the problem of what to do if your skin isn't working because the modelers have made some bizarre decision with the mapping. Personally, I change my skin to make the overall camo work. So if I have to change the shape of the pattern to make one of the weird mirrored panels work on both sides, then that's what I do. I'd rather have the pattern in the wrong place but the right colour overall than a perfectly precise camo with a single panel the wrong colour in the middle of it. When text is concerned, it depends. If it's small text, like the underside of the Lancaster wing, I don't mind if one side is mirrored and so therefore backwards. There's supposed to be a nose step under the side blister of the Catalina, but that panel is a mirrored one. On the opposite side, it comes out back to front. I can live with it because it's small and not that noticeable. But if you have great big serial number or a code letter on a panel that mirrors, that's another thing. If I can, I move them off the offending panel. But if that's not an option, because, I don't know, the underside of the wing is mirrored, then I choose to drop the skin. Occasionally, Gaijin will re-release the skin to make an improvement to it, like they did with the Spitfires a year ago. Not only did this correct some inaccuracies, but in a lot of cases it also fixed mirroring issues. So even if you have to give up on a skin now, you may get to do it in the future. One last thing before we go. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that my skin is subtly different from where it was at the end of part 5. In between making these two videos, I studied 2 photos and made a few alterations to the camo pattern and the upper and lower roundels. It no longer matches the painting I used when I first set up the camo pattern, but it's now accurate compared to real life. Okay, that wraps it up for this session. Next time, we'll be finishing off this camo by adding the weathering. See you then. Kia kaha.